Welcome back, ethics students. We're going to consider in this segment the supreme principle of morality, the section of Kant's writing on page 54 over to 57. We are going to consider the rational ground of the categorical imperative going from 57 to 58. And then we're going to consider the first formulation of the categorical imperative going from 58 to 59. So we're going to cover 5 pages of Kant. That's about a third of the reading. And you know that Kant is thick. So it's not easy material. That's why I'm acting more or less as a translator in order to help you understand what he's saying. Let's consider the supreme principle of morality. This is what I've been calling the one universal law of morality, and it's called the categorical imperative. Kant asks in the first sentence, but what sort of law can that be, the conception of which must determine the will, even without paying any regard to the effect expected from it, in order that this may be called good absolutely and without qualification? He's asking an important question. What could that law possibly be like if it's supposed to guide our actions all the time? And what could that law possibly be like if the law is not concerned about whether we succeed or fail, but rather the motivation behind it? Kant says in the next sentence, as I have deprived the will of every impulse which could arise to it from obedience to any law, there remains nothing but the universal conformity of its actions to law in general, which alone is to serve the will as a principle. In other words, I am never to act otherwise than so that I could also will that my maxim should become a universal law. What he is saying here is if we get rid of all of the particular knowledge about the situation, all of the facts about a situation, and look strictly at the concept of a moral law, what we see is that that moral law demands of us universalizability. Put somewhat simpler, the moral law is the moral law because it demands that maxims have to be universalizable. The moral law sorts out maxims that are universalizable from maxims that are not universalizable. Again, universalizability means the ability to make it a law of nature that everybody is operating on. And so other people would also be acting on that same law towards me. The formulation that he gives there, I am never to act otherwise than so that I could also will that my maxim should become a universal law, could be expressed in the language of the New Testament by saying, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It could also be expressed negatively in the Confucianist formula, never do to others what you wouldn't want to have done to yourself. In other words, it expresses the golden rule as we find it at Luke 6:31, and it expresses love of the neighbor as oneself, which is delivered at Luke 10:27. Let me just pause here very quickly to say that even though Kant is concerned primarily with giving a rational foundation to Christianity and the New Testament, he realizes that the moral law is going to be found in many religions. Indeed, the Confucianist principle that I gave just a moment ago from ancient China, the 4th century BC, says essentially the same thing. Never do to others what you wouldn't want to have done to yourself. We're going to see this universal moral law in every culture in some form or another, at least potentially. And so, while it's very true that Kant is trying to give a rational foundation to Christianity, that's not to put it above Islam or Judaism or Taoism or Buddhism or Hinduism. Just the opposite. What he is saying is that any system of religion, any culture, is going to be moral if and only if it respects the law of loving oneself or loving the neighbor as oneself, the golden rule. Okay, now, proceeding on, he says in the very next sentence, here now it is the simple conformity to law in general, without assuming any particular law applicable to certain actions, that serves the will as its principle, and must so serve it if duty is not to be a vain delusion or a chimerical notion. I am willing to speculate you probably did not understand that sentence. No one ever does without some sort of guiding help. So let me tell you that the law here is going to be one that is not tied to particular circumstances and is based strictly in the notion of law, or as he calls it, the conception of law. That's where we have to read between the lines and slow down for a second and try to explain this. Every rational being has the ability to understand and identify laws. We see the law of nature. We discover the law of electromagnetism, the law of pendular momentum, the principle of action and reaction. Human beings can understand laws. No other being can. Irrational beings do not have a concept of law, not to mention inanimate objects, have no conception of law. But human beings not only can entertain the pure concept, the pure rational concept of law, we strive to do that all the time. It is an important rational drive of ours to find a deeper law. So everyone eventually comes to understand, say, take the simplest example, the law of gravity. We understand that it is a universal, unconditional law that every object is going to seek a center of gravity. We understand that as such. Newton formulated it, but every one of us early on in life understands that when you drop something, it falls to the ground. Why? Because it's seeking the center of gravity in the center of the earth and will not fall up or fall to the side. We always are trying to find laws around us, whether laws of society, laws of personal interaction, laws of nature. Human beings, as rational beings, always try to formulate and understand laws behind things. Animals do not. Animals do not try to understand why it is that when they jump off of a chair, they always fall to the ground. They behave that way, but they don't understand it as a law. They don't have the concept of law as such. Only a human being does. And obviously an apple falling from a tree has no concept of law as such. It's behaving according to a law, but it doesn't understand the concept of law. The cat jumping off of the chair behaves according to the law of gravity, but it doesn't understand it. Only human beings understand the notion of law. So, what does the moral law have to do? The moral law has to demand that we consider all behaviors according to a universal standard that has no exceptions. There has to be a concept of law pertaining to how we treat others. Otherwise, there's no such thing as morality. This is what he means by the last part of the sentence. If duty is not to be a vain delusion or a chimerical notion. If there's going to be any such thing as duty and obligation, it has to be based in an understanding and awareness of the concept of law as such. Okay, well, where does this go in terms of particular behavior? We can apply this to a maxim, and the maxim that he considers is on page 54, about 3/4 of the way down. Whether it is prudent or whether it is right to make a false promise. You know what a false promise is. It's a promise that you make knowing you're going to break it. In other words, it's a lie. Okay, now, is it right or wrong to make a promise to somebody knowing that you're going to break it? Be aware, first of all, that this does involve treatment of another person. It is how I am going to relate to another person. I don't make promises to a chair or promises to a table. I can only make promises to a person. So this is automatically going to involve treatment of others. How do I decide whether it's right or wrong? Well, we formulate it in terms of a maxim, a rule of behavior. Here the rule of behavior is, when I want to, I will promise something to another person knowing that I am not going to fulfill that promise. There's the maxim. Any maxim is either moral or immoral, as we've said before, or if it doesn't involve treatment of others, it may be non-moral, but as long as it involves treatment of others, it's either moral or immoral. How do we distinguish moral from immoral actions? We ask, if that maxim were universal, in other words, if it were a law, like the law of gravity, would I want to be treated that way as a rational being? If I would want to be treated that way, then it's a moral maxim. It conforms with the law. It's in agreement with the law, the simple concept of law. If I am going to do that, but I wouldn't want to have that done to me, that violates a concept of law. Now I'm saying, well, it applies in most situations, but not in this situation. That's no longer in conformity with the simple concept of a law. Now, it still could be of enormous advantage to me to falsely promise something to someone. I might promise somebody, I'll love you in the future, in order to have sex with them, for example. But I know I'm not going to be with them in the future. That could be to my advantage in some meaning of the word advantage. But if I operate according to that principle of making an exception of myself, it would be prudent. In other words, it could be to my advantage, but it would still be evil in the sense of being an action of ill will. I am placing myself above the law and saying I'm an exception to this. I'm going to do it because I want to. So he says on page 55, for to deviate from the principle of duty is beyond all doubt wicked. That's in German, böse. We could translate that as evil, wicked or evil, morally wrong. But to be unfaithful to my maxim of prudence may often be very advantageous to me, although to abide by it is certainly safer. In other words, doing evil still might result in my enormous advantage. I don't think I need to explain that much. For example, robbing a bank might be to your enormous advantage prudentially. You'd get a bunch of money. But you would not want to have your money stolen out of a bank. You wouldn't want to be the teller who is being threatened, and so on. So it would be evil. It would be an action of ill will, and the maxim would be morally wrong, even if it were advantageous. Now, universalizability means that I am willing to accept the action as reciprocal. What that means is, as soon as I do that to you, you're going to do that to me. You're going to treat me in the same way. Kant says, now we're at the middle of 55, should I be content that my maxim, to extricate myself from difficulty by a false promise, should hold good as a universal law for myself as well as for others? And should I be able to say to myself, everyone may make a deceitful promise when he finds himself in a difficulty from which he cannot otherwise extricate himself? Then I presently become aware that while I can will the lie, I can by no means will that lying should be a universal law. For with such a law there would be no promises at all, since it would be in vain to allege my intention in regard to my future actions to those who would not believe this allegation, or if they over hastily did so, would pay me back in my own coin. Hence my maxim, as soon as it should be made a universal law, would necessarily destroy itself. There's a lot of deep stuff there. I can by no means will that lying should be a universal law. What does he mean by that? As a rational being, I couldn't want that. That's what he means by will. To will is to want as a rational being. The standard is never going to be to want something as an irrational being, but rather to want something as a rational being. Could I want, as a rational being, for people to lie to me? Could I want, as a rational being, for someone to tell me, yes, I'll be with you in the future, just in order to have sex with me? That would not be to my advantage. I would be being misled. And so, as a rational being, I couldn't want to be misled, because what I'm being given is an image of reality that isn't true. To make a false promise means for the other person to anticipate a reality that's not going to come to pass. If the other person realizes I'm lying when I make the promise, then of course they're going to reject me. So in that sense, making that false promise is not going to be successful. It would backfire. But even if they did, as he puts it, over hastily accept it, even if the person believed me, once they found out that I'm not there in the future with them, they would, as he puts it, pay me back in my own coin. If my actions, if my maxims as a rational being are anticipated to be universal law, then I have to anticipate them doing the same thing to me. In other words, reciprocating that same action. It has to be reciprocal. So when I am imagining telling that person the lie to manipulate them, I also have to imagine everybody in the universe treating me in the same way and treating each other in the same way, manipulating other people. Now, I might want that as an irrational person. There's no doubt that I might want that as an irrational person, but would I want that as a rational person? No, because it would distort my sense of reality and truth. I could only want it as an irrational person if I don't care about reality or if I want some kind of illusion. And there are people who want to believe false promises. There are people who realize that's a false promise, but I sure want to believe it. But that is not going to allow that promise to conform to universal law. As soon as I get this image, this double image of me treating that person to manipulate them and that person manipulating me in a way I don't want, then the proposed behavior destroys itself. The maxim destroys itself, as he says. What does that mean? There's a rational contradiction. It's like saying, it's raining today and it's not raining today. The contradiction itself is offensive to me as a rational person. My conscience, as my moral voice, finds it offensive, and it rejects it. So I have this pang of conscience, and I reject that behavior. Okay, now putting it in the big picture again. We go through life trying to improve our will. That's the purpose of life, to get a better and better will. In doing so, what we do is to accumulate in our conscience, our faculty of practical judgment, more and more maxims that we've judged as either moral or immoral. The maxims we've judged as moral, we abide by, we act by, and the maxims that we judge as immoral, we reject and we do not act according to them. What we have just done in the very first example of this in the reading is to realize that the maxim that I should purposely lie to somebody to manipulate them is immoral, and I reject it. Now I know, as someone who is learning, someone who's becoming morally mature, that it's never the right thing to manipulate someone. That gets stored away, and the next time that I'm in a situation where I'm contemplating manipulating somebody, the voice of conscience tells me, that's wrong, you shouldn't do it. Okay, now, one possible response you might have to this is that while Kant is spinning out a web of philosophical concepts that are highly theoretical, that's not the way people think. If he believes that he's trying to get to the essence of morality and what the New Testament is talking about, he's completely wrong, because none of our common sense has anything to do with this. That, though, he rejects entirely. On the top of page 56, in the first full paragraph, Kant says, "Thus then, without quitting the moral knowledge of common human reason, we have arrived at its principle. And although no doubt common men do not conceive it in such an abstract and universal form, yet they always have it really before their eyes and use it as the standard of their decision." Kant is saying here in plain English, he understands that almost no one thinks in these terms or thinks theoretically like he does. But if you look at how people make their decisions, it's in complete agreement with what he's saying. When he talks about common human reason, what he means is the faculties that we all share. One of the faculties we all share is the faculty of practical reason, or conscience. We all have a conscience. And no matter how simply or unreflectively we act, we still are asking ourselves, would I want that to be done to me? So without all the terminology, we've still arrived at a notion of a common conscience. That raises a lot of issues, doesn't it? What if we reject the idea that there's a common conscience, that each culture phrases it its own way? That's not a problem. Kant realizes early on in the very first paragraph, he says there's anthropological differences. Different cultures will express this in different ways. But the point that he's making is whether you're in ancient Egypt or 24th century China or the first man on Mars, you still have this faculty of conscience that you are going to consult, and if you don't consult it, it will consult you. In other words, it will give you a pang of conscience when you violate it. A deeper issue is the notion that there is no content at all to the universal law, and one culture may decide part of conscience is to kill other people. In other words, a culture may decide what's good is to run around killing everybody, even who's innocent. And what's bad is to not murder them. You surely, if I'm doing this properly, you'll surely remember the Kwaki-Oodles and the Dobu Islanders. As a culture, what were their cultural decisions? Well, the Dobu Islanders had this notion that everybody is out to poison each other. Everybody is out to kill each other. So if you're a good Dobu Islander, you try to kill everybody and you avoid them so that they don't kill you. The Kwaki-Oodles, what was their cultural mission? To find the last man standing. Who is it that really is at the center of the universe? Who is it that is the strongest shaman? Who is it that has the strongest magic? In order to determine that, there's a sort of war of all against all, and you try to take other people's coups, other people's headdresses, by killing them. So to play the game, to be a good Kwaki-Oodle, you have to kill others and avoid being killed. Doesn't that show that their consciences operate on different content than the conscience of, say, a Christian, a Jew, or a Muslim who says that you shall not kill? That's a much more difficult question for Kant to handle, but he can. And what he's going to suggest is that entire cultures, not to mention individuals, but entire cultures can either fail to listen to conscience or to not even be aware of it. But that over time, over human history, human beings become more and more aware of conscience. And they use that as the rule. And even among the Dobu Islanders and Kwakiutls, implicit in their cultural mission is the idea, I don't want that to be done to me. I don't want somebody to kill me, so I am going to kill them. That, though, does not conform with the simple concept of law, that law applies to everybody. So what Kant is going to say is that some cultures have a inadequate, incomplete, or even completely wrong concept of law and what law should be. Now you might say, well gosh, that's ethnocentric, or that's culturally supremacist, or it is just him projecting Christian European values on people who are not Christian Europeans. That is entirely understandable that you would have that notion. Kant is going to have an image, though, of rationality over a very long period of time. What he is going to say is that some cultures are stuck in a or immoral state of being, but that those people and those cultures as a whole have the potential for understanding the rule of law and the simple concept of law as universalizability. We can see, for example, with the Kwakiutls that since they oppress women and subjugate women, manipulate women, treat them as non-people really, that there could be an awareness among the women that they're not being treated properly. And among the women there could be a rising consciousness of the demands for equality that are implicit in law. And the women could change the society, just like an aberrant Dobu Islander might change his society. And so one culture, one social group, over time evolves in its morality. And Kant says that's true of Christian Europe too. It didn't start off being, nor is it now necessarily, the paradigm of Christian morality. It is going through a process of evolution where it is moving towards a more moral society, but that's a work in progress. Okay? The moral law has to be universal. Why does it have to come from a concept? This is where he now turns his attention in the second full paragraph of 56. It has to come from a pure idea, because the only other possibility is that it would come from concrete cases, particular cases, by induction, what a logician would call induction. Kant completely rejects the idea that we could, by seeing a number of different examples, finally come to a universal law based on just looking at particular examples. Why? Because we would have already had to decide that these examples are the ones that are good and those examples are the ones where treatment is wrong. In other words, to do it by induction, looking just at examples, you would already have to know what is the good. But that cannot be. So it has to derive from an awareness, a recognition of a concept, an a priori concept that's already in our minds as rational beings. Now, he applies this on page 56 to a passage in the Bible. And you may have read on 56 him talking about the Gospels and not understood what he was saying there. Here the issue is the relationship of the moral law to Jesus Christ. He's going to turn to a particular passage in the Gospels in order to show that a law cannot be derived from a particular example. Well, where in the heck does it say that in the Bible? Not explicitly, but what he does is to turn to Mark chapter 10, verses 17 through 18, and he doesn't cite it there, but that's the actual reference. And he considers the relationship between Jesus Christ and the moral law. Now, Jesus Christ he is taking to be an example of goodness, but not the moral law itself. What is the relationship between the moral law itself and Jesus Christ? That is it not a deep theological question? You could rephrase it briefly to ask, what's the relationship between Jesus and the Golden Rule? Which one comes first? Is the Golden Rule based on an induction from what's true of Jesus? Or do we say that Jesus Christ is good and the Son of God because he instantiates or exemplifies perfectly the moral law? Here's how Kant puts it. Even the Holy One of the Gospels, meaning Jesus, must first be compared with our ideal of moral perfection, meaning the moral law, before we can recognize him as such. In other words, before we can conclude that Jesus is a good person, we have to already know what's goodness according to the law. Well, where does it say that in the Bible? Here comes Mark 10, 17 through 18. Jesus says, "Why call ye me whom you see good? None is good or the model of good, but God only, whom ye do not see." That's the passage. Then Kant comments, "But whence have we the conception of God as the supreme good? Simply from the idea of moral perfection, which reason frames a priori and connects inseparably with the notion of a free will." Let's take that one step at a time, because this is really difficult. Let's go to the larger context of Mark 10, verses 17 through 18. This is the situation. Jesus and his disciples are passing through a small village, and someone in the village has heard already that they're coming, and he knows a little bit about Jesus. So the man comes out and he addresses Jesus as good teacher. Jesus stops him and says, "Why do you call me good when none is good other than God himself?" Okay, now the comments here in the brackets, that's not in the Bible, that is Kant's addition to it. But Jesus responds to the man, "Why do you call me good when the only thing that is good is God only?" What Kant is saying is the Bible here says that we can't call Jesus himself good unless we know God. But he asks, where do we get the idea of God? This is an enormous theological question, and if you go to a theological seminary and study theology seriously, this is going to be one of the deeper issues that you'll come across. How do we form the concept of God? His answer is that we take the concept of goodness and then we add to it the concept perfection. What is God? God is the perfectly good being. And that has to be connected, as he puts it, to a notion of free will. Why? God is the being that is perfectly good out of choice. Not because he has to be, not because he accidentally is, but God is the being that chooses to be perfectly good. So we take these concepts and we put them together. But what does that mean? That means that before we can even get a concept of God, we already have to have a notion of what is good. And that notion of goodness is the golden rule. It is the demand of universalizability. It is loving another person, the neighbor, as yourself, loving the enemy as yourself. What does that mean? What Kant is saying is that the universal law is the golden rule. And when we imagine a being that is perfectly acting according to the golden rule, we form an idea of God. Then, when we see an individual like Jesus Christ, and he immediately reminds us of that image of God, then we say, well, he's good. That's the only way that we can judge Jesus as good, is that he is perfecting the image that we have of God, which is, in turn, an image of the being that perfectly conforms to universal love. He repeats this logical point by saying, imitation finds no place at all in morality, and examples serve only as encouragement. In other words, they put beyond doubt the feasibility of what the law commands. They make visible that which the practical rule expresses more generally, but which they can never authorize us to set aside the true original, which lies in reason, and to guide ourselves by examples. That's pretty thick, isn't it? But what he's saying is this. Imitation is not goodness. Imitation and examples can only remind us of a concept, an idea. They can never provide us with the content of the idea. And when we say in the New Testament, when we have this example, this individual, Jesus Christ, what he does is to place beyond all doubt the feasibility of what the law commands. In other words, the stories about Jesus proves to us beyond any doubt that we can lead a moral life, that we can live according to the golden rule. beyond any doubt. Why? The example of Jesus encourages us to know that. It's an illustration of how to live actually, really, according to the golden rule. Why is Jesus the Son of God, and why do we believe that? If we do, because he perfectly conforms to the golden rule. And there are countless verses in the Bible where Jesus says this is the one and only moral law. Love your neighbor as yourself. There's Luke 18 through 27. There's Matthew 19, verse 16, and Luke 10, verses 25 through 37. Jesus says this is the one universal moral law that I've come to deliver. And what he does is he instantiates it, he's an example of it, he exemplifies it, but he doesn't prove it. Only the idea that, as Kant says, is the true original that lies in reason, only that can do it. So we've got a true original concept and image of goodness, and that is universalizability, to take others as equal, interchangeable, and reciprocal to ourselves. So down this now is the last 6 lines on 56. Kant wrote, "It is not only of the greatest necessity, in a purely speculative point of view, it's also of the greatest practical importance to derive these notions and laws from pure reason, to present them pure and unmixed, and even to determine the compass of this practical or pure rational knowledge. In other words, to determine the whole faculty of pure practical reason." If you're following what he says, you could still wonder why. Why would it not be possible to teach and learn morality strictly from a set of examples? Maybe putting it biblically, why isn't it possible that we could learn how to lead our lives and what to do just by the New Testament? Here now, I'm going to give you an example that may be so poignant that it is unpleasant. Certainly, if you read the entire New Testament, you will not come across the coronavirus. It simply is not mentioned in any way, shape, or form in the entire New Testament. What that would mean is that if I could learn the entirety of morality from the New Testament, I could not possibly know what to do in terms of how to treat other people with regard to the coronavirus. I would only know how to treat other people with regards to what is considered in the New Testament. But there are other situations that go beyond the particular a posteriori or the particular exact facts of the situation in the Bible. If, though, what we have is an idea that is in our reason as a true original, we can always use that true original concept to decide what to do. So let's just take a real poignant example. Suppose that my maxim is, whenever I can, and I know that I have a virus, I'll go up and breathe in somebody's face and give them the virus. Now, the Bible doesn't say specifically whether that would be a good or a bad action, but since we have the pure concept of universalizability in our consciences, we would know right away. I wouldn't want to be treated like that. I wouldn't want to have somebody come up in my face and purposely try to give me a virus, and so I shouldn't do it to others. What that shows is the power of the pure concept of reason. It is not some abstract, useless, kind of nerdy notion. It is eminently practical, as he puts it. And in that sense, what he means is it is eminently applicable to how we treat others. We'll always be able to figure out how to treat others by using the principle of universalizability, the principle of the golden rule. Turning to 57 very quickly, I just want to point out 2 lines that are worth quoting. 5 lines down, he says, "Since moral laws ought to hold good for every rational creature, we must derive them from the general concept of a rational being." This is really fascinating. He says, first of all, that moral laws hold good for every rational creature. Well, gosh, isn't that just human beings? Let's hold on to that thought for a second. He says, since that's true, it has to be derivable from a general concept of a rational being. What he means by that is, we're going to decide who's rational, who's irrational, what creatures are rational, what creatures are irrational, by their ability to formulate and recognize law as such. If any creature can understand and reason, think through, argue through principles that are lawful in nature, they're rational. Now, going back to what I said a minute ago about the Dobu Islanders and the Kwakiutls, let me make this totally clear. Don't make any mistake about this. Kant believes that the Dobu Islanders and the Kwakiutls are potentially as rational as Einstein. That's absolutely right. They are potentially as rational as the greatest physicist. They are able to understand the principle of law as such. He would argue they do not in the way that they treat women, and for the Dobu Islanders, everybody else in the tribe. They don't in fact do so, but they could. So they are rational beings who have to be held responsible and susceptible to the universal moral law. Returning to that phrase, every rational creature, what might he mean beyond that? Here's something that I think is really interesting. Kant, due to his time in the history of science, did believe that human beings, Homo sapiens, are the only rational creature. But if you know very much natural science since Kant, you know that science is discovering that more and more animal species are rational in some sense or another, even some birds, but certainly larger mammals, larger apes, even marine mammals like whales and dolphins have intelligence and rationality in some degree. Okay, to the extent that a creature is rational, they are liable to the moral law and the expectations of the moral law. So Kant would say, in short, if we discover that the great apes are rational creatures, then they too are subject to the universal moral law. Fine. Here's another thought. Remember from my biography of Kant that he was also the man that created the Big Bang Theory. He was very, very interested in the origin of the universe. And he had a developmental notion of the physical universe that did allow the possibility of extraterrestrials. In other words, in short, Kant does not necessarily believe that life exists only on Earth. Oh, so now apply that to that last line. if we have a close encounter, so to speak, with extraterrestrials, and we discover that they are rational in his sense, they would also be susceptible to the moral law. That, I think, is the larger point that he's making. Okay, now, that concludes the section on the supreme principle of morality. I want to cover one more here in this segment, and that's the rational ground of the categorical imperative. In other words, the rational ground of the supreme moral law. This is where we go to the boiler room, if I can use that metaphor, of morality. This is where we go to the deepest level where there is nothing underneath it. It's the boiler room of the ship. And Kant considers what you could call his deepest fear. Maybe we could theoretically identify this as Kant's big nightmare. What he's worried about is if the golden rule is really not the ultimate supreme principle of morality, but that it derives from something higher, something even more supreme, which would be, in his deepest fear, the principle of utility. Could it possibly be that the golden rule is one principle of morality because it follows from the principle of utility? Even more simply, his fear is that the golden rule would be valid because it benefits the most people with everybody counting equally. Expressing it yet another way, what if the rule, always treat others the way that you would want to be treated, is valid only because that's the way that we get to benefiting the most people? If that's true, then the categorical imperative is not the one universal law, it would be the principle of utility. And then he would be completely wrong in everything else he had said, because the principle of utility, for example, does worry about the object of the action and the consequences of it, rather than the maxim. It worries only about consequences and not maxims. And so he's completely knocked the legs from under himself, if that possibility is true. On 58, he says, who can prove by experience the non-existence of a cause, when all that experience tells us is that we do not perceive it? But in such a case, the so-called moral imperative, which as such appears to be categorical and unconditional, would in reality be only a pragmatic precept, drawing attention to our own interests and merely teaching us to take these into consideration. What if the basis of the categorical imperative is really just a pragmatic precept that is based in maximizing our interests? So he says, we'll therefore have to investigate a priori the possibility of a categorical imperative. And a few lines down, the categorical imperative alone has the purport of a practical law. All the rest may indeed be called principles of the will, but not laws, since whatever is only necessary for the attainment of some arbitrary purpose may be considered as in itself contingent, and we can at any time be free from the precept if we give up the purpose. On the contrary, the unconditional command leaves the will no liberty to choose the opposite. Consequently, it alone carries with it that necessity which we require in a law. That's really extremely thick, I understand. But what he is saying is this, that if the moral law depends entirely on consequences, then sometimes an action would be moral in one situation but immoral in another. And we would have to know the specifics of the situation in order to determine whether it was moral or not. Very concrete example here. Throwing someone out of a boat into the North Atlantic without a lifesaver. If the supreme moral law is really just the principle of utility, and it's really just a pragmatic precept, then in order to determine whether that's a good or bad action, throwing someone out of the lifeboat, we would have to know facts about the situation. So in one situation, if the lifeboat is way overcrowded and it's leaking and we'll all die if we don't throw somebody overboard, then by the principle of utility, we should throw somebody overboard, and maybe more than one. In another situation where the lifeboat only has, say, 2 people in it, there's no threat of anybody drowning, and there's a rescue ship right over there that's coming straight towards us, but I throw somebody into the North Atlantic anyway without a life preserver, according to the principle of utility, that would be wrong. But wait a minute, what that means is the same action, throwing someone into the North Atlantic without a life preserver, is both good and evil, depending on the situation. But that can never be if we remember the concept of law. Law demands no exceptions. Law demands that what the law says is always true. So the principle of utility cannot ever tell us this action is always wrong, this action is always right, regardless of circumstances. It is always going to have to bring in circumstances, and that violates the law, just like we could not say that the law of gravity just depends on who you are and at what time you lived. The law of gravity applies to everybody who ever lived and ever will live. So the law of gravity meets the standard of law. The principle of utility does not meet the standard of law. And so he concludes that it is an a priori synthetical practical proposition. And as there is so much difficulty in discerning the possibility of speculative propositions of this kind, it may be readily supposed that the difficulty will be no less with the practical. In other words, if we're left with the principle of utility, it's going to be difficult in situations to decide what's right and wrong. It may be impossible to decide what's right and wrong. I may need to throw this person overboard in one situation, but wait a minute. What if he's a doctor that knows the cure for cancer and I'm not? Maybe I should throw myself overboard and leave him in. In another situation that we've decided, well, we've got to throw somebody overboard, and we leave Jack the Ripper in the boat and throw over Mother Teresa, that doesn't make any sense either. So it's going to be extremely difficult to apply that precept practically, how we treat other people. But if we apply the golden rule, there will never be any doubt. I will ask myself, would I want to be thrown into the North Atlantic without a life preserver? And the answer is always going to be no, if I'm a rational person, taking rational person as a standard. So I am going to reject that treatment of anybody. And I don't have to know the particulars, so it's not that difficult. What that shows is that the golden rule, the categorical imperative, is the supreme principle above the principle of utility, although the principle of utility may be a moral maxim. But the moral maxim has to be judged by the standard of the categorical imperative, not vice versa. So he's shown the logical priority of the categorical imperative. Very quickly then, on 59, he says, there is therefore but one categorical imperative, namely this: act only on that maxim whereby thou canst at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Again, the notion of will means to want as a rational person. So what he's saying there is I should only act on those maxims, those behaviors that I'm considering, where I could, as a rational person, want them to be applied to me. Or in biblical language, I should only treat other people the way I would want to be treated myself. He expresses that again very much in terms of my analogy with the law of gravity in the very last sentence. Act as if the maxim of thy action were to become by thy will a universal law of nature. When trying to decide whether this behavior that I'm considering is moral or not, what I do is I imagine the universe, the entire universe, having a law of nature so that everybody else acts like that, just like it was the law of gravity. There are no criminals to the law of gravity. No one violates the law of gravity. So I imagine everybody behaving according to my behavior, including the way that they act towards me. If I can will that, if I can want that as a rational being, then that maxim is moral. That concludes this segment of Kant's Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals.